Morning. I'm Celestine Siame, and today I'll be presenting on Brexit, trading intermediates, and global value chain. That is beyond the UK and the EU. So this is the outline of my presentation. So as we all know, Brexit is currently in effect, and the UK is now a standalone country after being dependent on the EU for more than 40 years. And following this segregation, different possible Brexit scenarios have been adopted or may be adopted either in the short or the long term that could create economic impact in various forms, such as high structural unemployment, reduced FDI, growth deceleration, a more restricted EU migration, and a higher trade cost. So my study will focus on the effects of a higher trade cost. Why? Because with a higher trade cost, this will create trade policy effects between the UK, the remaining EU 27, and the rest of the world. However, it appears the discussion on the future trade relationship after Brexit has focused only on the UK and the EU, and the rest of the world countries have been ignored from the public debate. But it is important to consider this rest of the world countries. Why? Because most of them have the UK as their major trading partner. A majority of them also import from the larger EU market. So if both the UK and the EU are affected from Brexit, it creates a domino effect, and this rest of the world countries also get affected. And these are some key facts. So these are some key facts to confirm that. So these are 30 selected countries that trade most with the UK. And from these 30 selected countries, we can see that aside Sri Lanka and Mauritius, which have more than 20% of their export share to the UK, almost all the countries have more than 10% of their export share to the UK. So I think I'll go backwards a bit. So these are some key facts to confirm that. So these are 30 selected countries which trade most with the UK. And we can see that aside Sri Lanka and Mauritius, which have more than 20% of their export share to the UK, we have almost all the other countries having 10% of their export share to the UK. Another key fact is that if you look at the aggregate trade flows, that's the to and fro of imports, the to and fro from the UK. We can see that on the export side, the UK have about 62% of their export. That is, the EU have about 62% of their export to the UK. And the 30 selected countries which trade most with the UK have about 32%, and the rest of the world have about 6%. And on the import side, the EU imports about 52% from the UK. The 30 selected countries have about 36, almost 37%, and the rest of the world countries have about 11%. So this shows how the UK and the EU are integrated in global trading, and the need to look at the rest of the world countries when you are looking at the effects of Brexit on trade. Okay, so motivated by these considerations, I examine the effects of Brexit due to trade policy shock, which is not limited to only the UK and the EU, but with a much focus on the rest of the world countries which trade most with the UK. And to do this particularly, I answered two main questions. I came up with two main research questions. And the first one is, what are the welfare effects and the magnitude of gains from trade under different potential Brexit scenarios? And the second one is, how do these possible Brexit scenarios affect global value chains? So someone will ask, why do I want to look at global value chains with respect to Brexit? So due to the sharp fragmentation of production process and the reorganization of global economic activity, now global production is organized into what we call, it's integrated into what we call global value chains, whereby firms source inputs or they source components of products globally from multiple producers who are based in different countries, and they use them either as inputs or they use them as final consumption, which then makes it more relevant to look at models with multi-stage production instead of looking at a traditional gravity model. Why? Because with a traditional gravity model, the value added at the multiple stages of productions are hidden. Another reason too has to do with the cost of trade barriers, which will be multiplied due to the multiple movement of goods across national borders, which then means if like countries are participating on the value chain and there is a disruption in one part of the value chain, all the other countries participating will also be affected. And the third one has to do with the fact that growth in global value chains amplifies welfare gains to trade barriers than when we look at bilateral trade model. So what did I do for my study? I did three major things. I built a static general equilibrium. Then the second thing, I did a quantitative analysis. Then the third thing was I compared, the quantitative analysis was my calibration, which gave me the no Brexit equilibrium. Then I compared that with different counterfactual. So for my model, I have a multi-country and a multi-sector emitting model. And this model features 33 countries. I have the UK, the EU 27, and 30 selected countries. And I have 12 sectors, 11 tradable sectors, and a single service sector. So I use the input-output linkages, and I showed a trade policy shock with it. So for the quantitative analysis, I calibrated my model to match the 2015 era, that's the multi-region input-output data. And that calibrated model was what gave me the no Brexit equilibrium. That is the state of the world when Brexit has not even been conceived. So for the quantifactual, what I did was to look at 5 different possible Brexit scenarios that could happen after Brexit. So I look at the hard Brexit and I look at the soft Brexit. I look at the UK, the EU, FTA, which is the current Brexit, which is called the EU UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Then I look at what if the UK and the USA decide to form a free trade agreement, and what if the 3 regions, the UK, EU, and the USA, decide to form a free trade agreement. So to briefly, the hard Brexit is simply whereby the UK loses its single market access and custom union. So they live like they exit the EU without any agreement. And the soft Brexit is the case whereby they retain single market access. So they are not part of the custom union, but they are part of the single market access. So the current Brexit that they've agreed on is similar to the soft Brexit, but with the current Brexit, that is the TCA, they are not part of the single market access, and they are also not part of the custom union, but they came at an agreement. So it's between the hard Brexit and the soft Brexit. So this is a preview of the results I came up with. So for the results, I will briefly talk about the hard Brexit, the current Brexit, and the soft. So for the welfare losses, I measured welfare in terms of consumption equivalence. That's the consumption of the households. And I found welfare losses ranging from 0.01% to 3.06%. That is for the hard Brexit. And the average loss was about 1.61%. But when we look at the UK, that is the current Brexit in effect, there were also losses. The pattern of losses in the current Brexit and the hard Brexit are the same, just that the current Brexit losses are a bit smaller than that of the hard Brexit. Then for the soft Brexit, what happened is that like all countries, there was like a gain for all other countries, except for UK, which I expect the UK to experience a loss, and Iceland and Mauritius. I will explain further when I get to the results section. So in general, I would say there is with the results, I would say there was more losses in the hard Brexit than the UK and the EU FTA, and relatively minor losses under the soft Brexit. And for the global value chain participation, I look at just the effect under soft Brexit and the hard Brexit, because the other scenarios gave me similar results. So I focus on just the hard and the soft Brexit. And aside the UK and the EU getting affected in terms of their participation and positioning on the value chain, other countries like Singapore, Japan, China, South Korea, Kenya, Indonesia were also affected. So this is the model I use. So my model has like it's a household. It has household and it has firms. I have my good to be imperfect substitute. I have an elastic labor. I have one factor of production and a composite intermediate good. And all the goods and factor markets are perfectly competitive. I have mobile labor across sectors and immobile across countries. And I have costly trade. So I'm looking at both Iceberg trade costs and I'm looking at import tariff. So this is the household problem whereby firms, whereby consumers, right, maximize a utility problem. And for the alphas that you see in the model, those are the expenditure shares, that is to different sectors. And for the segments, those are the elasticity or substitution. So if we look at the summation of the alphas across countries, that is going from different sectors, they all sum up to one. And I have the total income of a country, which is the YG, which is, it constitutes that of the labor income and that of the revenue generated from import tariff. So this is the the production problem, whereby I have a runabout input production. And if I say runabout, it's whereby input is either used for final consumption or it's used as an intermediate input. And I have this being that is the output being produced in this case, depending on the technology, which is the AI, and I have it depending on the labor, that is the labor demanded, which is the L, and I have it depending on the composite intermediate input. And these composite intermediate inputs are sourced from all sectors of a country. So for the elasticity of substitution, the assumption here is that for the consumption and the production are the same. So this is the pricing in my model. So I have the cost of, that's the cost of producing, because I'm looking at intermediate input and the labor demand. The cost of the input bundle is a constitution of the wages and the prices. So that is the price index of the composite intermediate input. And for the price of a good, that will be the cost of that product divided by the technology of that country. Okay, so as I said, I have a costly trade. So I'm looking at Iceberg trade cost and I'm looking at import tariff. So for the cost of the good at a destination to be consumed, that is, if we are looking there, to be the price of the good produced in that country multiplied by the Iceberg trade cost, and the same with import tariff. So what I did in my model was that I combined both the Iceberg trade cost and the import tariff to get the CAPA. So that gave me a combined trade cost. So the price of a good at a destination of a country is going to be that combined trade cost times the price of that product. Okay, so this is my general equilibrium market clearing condition, which I wouldn't brief. Okay, so someone will ask, where is Brexit in my model? So the Brexit simply has to do with the trade cost. The effect of the Brexit in my study is simply coming from the trade cost. But I'm looking at two major trade costs here. I'm looking at tariff and I'm looking at non-tariff trade barriers, right? But for the non-tariff trade barriers, it's not easily observed, but it's part of Iceberg trade cost. So what I did was to calibrate my Iceberg trade cost, and I assumed that a fraction of that is my non-tariff trade barriers. So from there, that is the NTB. So the non-tariff trade barriers is what I term as the NTB. So when you look at the price in this case. So if you look at the price, so this is the tariff, this is the non-tariff trade barrier, and this is the Iceberg trade cost. So we can see that the Iceberg trade cost, we have the non-tariff trade barrier being subtracted from the Iceberg trade cost, which is a proportion of that, multiplied by these non-tariff trade barriers, then the tariff. So this gives me the pricing in the state of Brexit. So this is whereby we find Brexit in my study. Okay, so for my data, I use the error input output data. I use different sets of data, but for the main data was for the error input outputs MRA database, and I have 189 countries and I have 26 sectors in that data. So 20, beginning I said I have 12 sectors, and it's 12 sectors mainly because, so this is there. So this is from a paper, Guru Eta. I use the elasticities. Then these are the parameters I calibrated. So So this is the estimation of the tariff. I already talked about using the on-site trains data, using the WTO data and the country data. So this is the Iceberg calibration. So I look at an over-identified estimation whereby I have two data moments and two model moments, which calibrate just one set of parameters. That is the Iceberg trade cost. And the job here was to match the two data moments, which is the intermediate input of the input-output metrics and the final demand with the total value of inputs, import values for inputs and final good. So this is the calibrated Iceberg trade cost that I came up with. So for the different scenarios, for the hard Brexit, I use the MF. So that is the state whereby the UK, the trading between UK and other countries will fall back to the WTO. So that will be MFN tariff. And I simulated a 50% increase in non-tariff trade barriers because there will be high increase in non-tariff trade barrier between the UK and other countries. And for the soft Brexit, I'll talk about just the hard Brexit and the soft Brexit. For the soft Brexit, it's whereby they exit from the single market. So there is a zero tariff between the UK trade and the EU. But for the other countries, it depends. That is if the UK have already negotiated a new agreement or they've already replicated what they had under the EU. And for the soft Brexit too, there will be a very less increase in non-tariff trade barriers. So for the welfare, I measured my welfare in consumption, as I've already said. And the results of my welfare, so I'll talk about the soft and the hard Brexit. So we can see here that in the case there, almost all countries experience a loss for the hard Brexit. And for the soft Brexit, we can see a lot of gains. And for the hard Brexit, two countries that did not really see a loss was India and Korea. And I think India has to do with the fact that India has competitive advantage in IT, technology, engineering, and all those are. So I believe they are going to be a net gainer in terms of services when Brexit happens. And it also has to do with the trade cost. So if we look at a calibrated trade cost for the services, it's one of the highest trade costs. So this highest, so they are going to experience a gain from there because of the competitive advantage they have in terms of services, in terms of IT and other technology. Now, when we look at the pattern of what the effect that is the hard Brexit and the UK EU, we can see that the pattern is the same. They have the same pattern, but just that of the hard Brexit, there was a very high loss compared to the current Brexit, which is the UK EU FTA. Okay, so now global value chain. So for the global value chain, I just look at two scenarios, the hard and soft, because it was the same results for other scenarios. And from here, we can see that almost all countries in the state of Brexit, the pattern, that is that the backward participation is the same as the domestic value added, which is the same as the domestic value added versus the gross the ratio of the domestic value added to the gross output. And we can see that under the Brexit, there will be some slight fall in terms of the participation of global value chain, both in terms of backward participation and in terms of forward participation. And the same thing also appears when we look at the positioning in both at the upstream and the downstream. We can see that under Brexit, which is the hard and the soft Brexit, the change in the participation, the positioning changes fall down to a bit lower rate. So in conclusion, I would say there was significant impact of warfare on other countries aside the UK and the EU, and there was relatively minor losses under soft Brexit. So I would say the hard Brexit is the worst case scenario. The soft Brexit is the least detrimental, and the UK, the EU, FTA, there was also some losses. And for GVC, that is the global value chain participation and positioning changes following Brexit, hard Brexit and soft Brexit, there was quite some changes. So overall, I would say most of the changes in the warfare and in the global value chain has to do with the non-tariff trade barriers because there was more heterogeneity than that of the tariff. And finally, my conclusion would be that the magnitude of the impact, right, of the losses will depend on the trade agreement that the UK finally negotiates with other countries after Brexit. Thank you.
So if there's any questions, please press the mic buttons in front of you and to unmute, and then you can ask.
The India result, I didn't quite, and the India and Korea result, which is I didn't quite see the logic to the model of how they get a gain. Like I understand what you were saying in terms of the comparative advantage, but through the model, I didn't quite see how the model would use the comparative advantage in the services to translate to a gain. So can you just walk through that?
So I said competitive advantage.
Yeah.
Not comparative.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's what I, so in terms of, so this comparative advantage is not in this particular model.
Okay.
So it's just like in terms of competing with other countries, because they are skillful in IT and all those.
And that's what the British are doing particularly well. And so then when the trade costs come, it's a pure kind of diversion story.
Yes, so because they will be more in demand because of their
Yeah.
skillful nature. So it's going to benefit them compared to other countries.
But is there something also that the services are less likely to be used as inputs in these GVCs?
It could be possible.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I enjoyed it. I have a question about, in the beginning, you showed that Sri Lanka and Mauritius were really, whether exposed is the right word, in terms of a high trade share with the UK, but they seem to come out quite differently. Is that because if I remember, Mauritius was particularly badly affected, but not Sri Lanka?
Yeah, so Sri Lanka was also affected, but I don't have Sri Lanka. I didn't select Sri Lanka as part of, I have like 33 countries. So I selected just 12 countries, but Sri Lanka was also very affected. Yeah, so in my main paper, which I can share with you later, I have Sri Lanka getting also very affected.
So in terms of thinking about, let's say, how countries rack up in terms of losses and are they only purely a share of the size of trade, or do they also depend upon the sectors in which they're trading, the substitutability across different countries? So in the sense of your model, does that allow for that aspect, or do they just neatly rank up by the magnitudes of trade?
So I wouldn't say it just has to do with the share of the trade. I think everything combined, the sector, the substitutability and all those things. But I can't show everything on the screen, but everything inclusive. So I think, Amit, I didn't get the last part of your question, so I'll be happy. Okay.
Partly following on his question, it would be interesting, I guess, to unpack a little bit more the service sector, right? Because I guess data limitation makes it easier to make it one. But precisely because of what you said, it would be nice to have a little bit more sectors in the service, because you could.
Yeah, so I did have 15 services sector, but what I did was to aggregate them. But I have another results whereby I have it for each of the different sectors, right? So there are 15 of them, which I can slightly, let me just go down. Yeah, so these are my sectors. Yeah, so these are all the services sectors. So I have 15 of them. But I aggregate all these sectors to one. That is why I said I have 26 sectors, but in the main model, I said I have 12 sectors, so 11 tradables and that. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
I have a question. So I believe when UK was in the EU and they had that trade pattern, okay, after the Brexit, what sort of preparatory policies that the UK government took in order to balance the trade deficit, because I believe when there was a Brexit, UK happened to escalate in terms of trade deficit. What sort of policies that the government of the UK sort of took to down shock the trade deficit that will upcoming happen in the future? And did it work actually if it happened?
Okay, so you're talking about trade deficits, which is a bit beyond my scope here. But what I would say is that, so if you are looking at the deficit part, right, and we want to look at the UK coming out of the EU, what the UK began doing before they finally came out was that they began replicating some of the agreements that they had with the UK, with the EU, the same agreement. So like a country like Kenya, a country like South Korea, like South Africa, right? They replicated that. So the replication means it's the same thing. So what happens is that they will trade under the same conditions. So I believe those are some of the policy, right? And another thing too could be that some countries, they will feel like, okay, under the EU, we didn't really have a very good like negotiation. So this will be an opportunity, especially if they are focusing on developing countries. This will be an opportunity for us to do our own negotiation with those countries. So I believe all these kind of different policies on trade agreement coming into effect is something which is going to reduce the trade deficit, which I don't think it's fully doing because it's still in the initial stages.
So we have a question from a YouTube participant as well. Evelyn from University Malaya asked, did you consider NTMs, non-tariff measures? Are these measures measured as or modeled as a fixed cost?
They are not fixed costs. So that is the NTBs. They are not fixed costs. They are variable costs. So it depends on the country trading and all that, and the destination and the distance.
Okay.
Yes, because when we look at non-tariff trade barriers, that is the Iceberg trade code. It has to do with custom checking, licensing, quotas, import substitution. So many different things comes into place here.
Right, so we'll thank you very much. We'll move on to our second presenter, Yang Zhu, who will present via WebEx.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to the GVC conference in the World Bank. And my name is Yang Zhou, and I'm from Fudan University. Today, I'm gonna presenting this project, which is the US-China trade wall and global value chains. Okay. So the motivation, so the big background, so the US-China trade wall is the most significant trade wall since the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930s. So basically during the trade wall, there are 550 billion Chinese goods was announced to be attacked, and 185 billion US dollars of United States trade good announced to be targeted. And so the trade war is still an ongoing process, but in this project, I'm gonna focus on the period from January 2018 to January 2022, which is when the phase 1 deal established. So from January 2018 to January 2020, so the weighted average of US tariffs on Chinese goods increased from 3.1% to 19.3%. At the same time, China's tariffs on US goods increases from 8% to 20.3%. So nowadays, if we consider the most current tariffs, the tariffs level is still like pretty close to the level on in January 2020. So basically, tariff doesn't change so much after the phase 1 deal. So The trade war can basically be divided into 2 rounds. So the first round starts in July to August 2018. So in this round, the U.S. implements an additional 25% of the tariffs on $50 billion of Chinese exports. As a retaliation, China implements additional 25% of tariffs on $50 billion on U.S. exports. So most of the goods in this round are on intermediate goods. So that's round 1. And round 2 starts in the following year, June 2019. And in this round, U.S. implements 10% to 25% of tariffs on $200 billion Chinese goods. And China implements 5% to 25% tariffs on $60 billion on U.S. exports. And since lots of intermediate goods are already included in the first round, so in the second round, there's more on consumption goods getting involved. So this graph shows the tariff changes over time. So the blue curve is China's tariffs on U.S. and the red one is U.S. tariffs on Chinese exports. So this is like the 2 rounds, and finally this is the tariff level on the phase 1 agreement. So that is a big picture about the trade war. And then the trade war occurs in the context of a growing global value chains. So as Celestine just introduced, global value chain involves each country focus on a particular stages of a production process. So all those following literatures introduce the measurement of global value chain. So this graph is a developed graph from the Oxford Development Report in 2020. The horizontal is the time and the vertical is the GVC's share of global trade. So basically it measures how much percentage of the global trade is contributed by global value chain. So the idea to measure it is, so we measure it using the inter-country or world input and output table, and to chase those goods, those exports that cross borders at least twice, and consider them as the trade of global value chain. So we can see from this picture that during the time we can see like this increase in GVC share of global trade, and recently the trade is around 45% to 50%. So now here comes my questions. So given the breakout of the trade war and the growing trend of global value chain, so what is the impact of the trade war on different industries and different countries in presence of global value chains? So basically the idea is when country facing the shock in tariffs, and if they are able to freely switch their sourcing places. So if we let the global value chains to be freely reshaped without any frictions, what could be the impact? So it's like when China is increasing the tariffs against the United States. So suppose like U.S. is able to shift its sourcing quickly from China to other substitutable Southeast Asian country, such like Vietnam and etc. So in that context, so what could be the impact on different country and different industries? So here are some findings. So in this paper, I quantify the impact of these 2 rounds of the trade war, and find that so the first round the CPI in the United States is going to increase by 0.03%, and the second round is increased by 0.06%. So this percentage change is compared to, both of them is compared to the benchmark where the trade war hasn't started yet. So, and the second finding is that both rounds of trade war reduce U.S. downstream employment, will increase on U.S. upstream employment. And the intuition is that those downstream employment relies on those imports imported from China, and raising up the price of the imports going to hurt the downstream employment. But those U.S. upstream employment happen to be like protected by the tariffs imposed on Chinese imports. So so those groups, the upstream employers, and upstream producers happens to be the groups which are benefit from from this trade war. And also, like this especially hit the U.S. industries that heavily relied on targeting Chinese intermediate goods. As for the welfare analysis, I choose the year before the trade war as a base year. So choose 2017 as a base year. So in terms of real income, in the trade war, in the round one, it's going to cost China about $12.2 billion US, and cost the United States about $7.5 billion US. And the second round is going to cost China about $35.2 billion US, and cost the United States about $15.6 billion US. So the contribution of this paper is that, so this paper builds a two-stage multi-industry, multi-country general equilibrium model to study the impact of the trade war while taking into account the shaping of GVC. So as I emphasized before, that we allow country to freely to change their sourcing places without any frictions. And so we built the general equilibrium model with the reshaping of GVC, and allows this tariff revenue to be collected and rebated to the local consumers. And also, when I calibrate this model, I add another dimension of comparative advantage at a stage level by estimating the share of each industry that is in upstream and in downstream stages. So basically, in my model, the comparative advantage is not only at industry level, at country level, but also at stage level, because I want to capture the structure that countries are able to focus on different stages of different industries. So there are several related literature, and so the top one of those related literature about U.S.-China trade war, and the bottom one, the ones focusing on and study the structure of global value chains. So in all of those papers, I want to compare my result versus the one from the Fashika-Bombs 2020. So they also build a general equilibrium model, but instead of like building a general equilibrium model of the world, they focus on the United States and taking the import price as given. And so they figure that the trade war is going to cost the United States about $7.2 billion US, which is a number smaller than mine. So I think like the intuitive explanation is that in my model, I let all the countries to freely adjust their sourcing places, which could amplify the impact of the tariffs. So here is a model. So it's a multi-country model. So like I stands for the country index, and S stands for industry, and the variety Z is the variety index within each industry. So this part is very similar to the part presented by Celestine. So the utility of each country is a Douglas-Off function of consumption from each industry, and BS is the expenditure share on a particular industry. As for this big CIS, it's going to be an CES aggregator of all the varieties within that industry. So, and the domestic consumer budget constraint is the following. And the consumer income is from two sources. One is from the wage income, and the other is from the tariff revenue income collected by the government. So again, the government collected tariff revenue and rebated back to the domestic consumer. So as for the technology, so here is the part I model global value chain in my paper. So this is a technology for each final product Z in an industry. So I assume that each final product Z is produced through two stages. And suppose like the stage 1 occurs in this particular country I, here is the production function. So basically the production process needs a labor input, which is stage specific. So the superscript stands for stage specific, and country specific, industry specific. So these labor and composite intermediate goods I. So the composite intermediate goods I share the same format as the utility function. And this AIS1Z is a unit factor requirement, which captures the total factor productivity of the technology in stage 1. And the gamma here is a labor share in stage 1. As for stage 2, so the stage 2 it's going to rely on several things. So the stage 2 will also need a labor input, which is the LIS2 here, and the composite goods, similar format as a utility function, and the composite intermediate goods in stage 1. So the labor share is still gamma, and this is the unit factor requirement. But the difference is that in stage two gonna require an output from stage 1, which is captured by this XISZ. So this XISZ and this YISZ are same type of goods. But the stage 2 consumers have these options to either import this stage 1 product from its local country or from a foreign country. And finally, like this is a demonstration of the format of the composite intermediate good. So again, so the notation is complicated, but the whole idea is that it shares the same format as the utility function. So first, it's a Douglas aggregators of all the industries. And then each industry is a CES aggregator of all the varieties within that industry. So the difference is that the expenditure share is different. So the BS here is the final goods expenditure share from final consumption expenditure share from a particular industry S. And this BS prime S captures the input and output linkages. So it's like the destinations industry's share, import share from a particular sourcing industry. But other than that, the format is same as the utility function. So in summary, the structure looks a little bit confusing, but in summary, the main point is there are two types of intermediate goods in the consumption process. So the first one is this XIZ here, which is this guy. So
Yangju?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt,
Yes.
but there's around 5 minutes left.
Okay, so I will quickly go through it. So basically two types of intermediate goods. So one is the stage 1 product, connect 2 stages, and the other is the stage 2 product, which is used in production of both stages. So then I introduced this trade cost includes both transportation and Iceberg, both Iceberg transportation and tariffs. And so this is a 2-stage production structure. So I have like J countries in that, so which means there's going to be J square production paths. So this project relies on this assumption on the productivity of a production path. So like this is the unit factor requirement at stage 1, and this is unit factor requirement at stage 2. The exponent is a share of stage 1, and this is a share of stage 2. So like if I connected the productivity along the production path, assume the path follows a Frechet distribution and determined by this parameters big T. So it's just like the traditional Frechet distribution in an EK model. And the products from both stages are tradable, and the countries only import from the location offering the lowest price. So given that assumptions, I can get an analytical solutions and solve the general equilibrium about the model. So basically, if there's a tariff shock, there's going to be the change in each country's sourcing strategy. So country is going to source from different places who offering a lower price by taking into account the trade shock, and then it's going to change all the endogenous variables. So I'm going to skip the part of calibration, and finally, I want to show some numerical result about the 2 rounds of the trade. So like this is the percentage change in the United States and China. So this is like the price level change in the round 1 and round 2, and then I have like the upstream employment change, the downstream employment change. So basically, we see that for both country and both ones, the upstream employment actually increases and downstream employment decreases. And intuitions that like both country, if you're looking at your targeting list, lots of goods included in the targeting list are probably intermediate goods. So we're going to protect domestic stream producers and hurt the domestic downstream producer who rely on those upstream imports. And so this graph shows the goods that targeted in different 2 rounds of the trade war, and this shows the industries that hurt it the most and benefit the most in the first round of trade war and the second round of trade war. And finally, I did this welfare analysis, so which is the result I showed before. So I compare the real income in each country by choosing 2017 as the base year, and in the first round, China is going to cost for 12.2 billion, US cost 7.5 billion. Second round trade war cost China 35.2 billion, and it cost United States 15.6 billion. So yes, that's the result of this project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll now open up the floor to the questions or discussion. Any comments?
Actually, I have one question.
Yes.
Normally we think of rules of origin only in preferential trade agreements, but in this case of a trade war, every other country has preferential access. But you could also see a switching of global value chains, and some work that Shafat and I've done shown that a lot of the other countries which exported more to the United States were importing more from China.
Yes.
What do we know about the rules of origin requirements that China or the United States imposed? And if there were no rules of origin, was it, did countries have infinite flexibility to switch value chains?
Okay, so basically, so when I calibrate, thank you for your question, first of all. So when I calibrate model, so for the roots of origin is like calibrated based on the year before the trade war. So the year before, so I use I use those trade flows before the trade wars to calibrate the comparative advantage in different country, different industry, and different stages. So I assume that so I assume this comparative advantage, which is captured by this particular parameter here. So I assume this comparative advantage parameters doesn't change over time. So like this is the one like determines the roots of the sourcing places. So given that, I only let the tariffs to change. And so basically, finally how the GVC is shaped is a joint effect of both the comparative advantage and the trade cost. So it's like the benchmark is the comparative advantage plus the trade cost before the trade war, and now it's the same comparative advantage, but the tariff is changed. Does that answer a question?
Yes, thank you. But we can talk about it more at some stage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
Based on your presentation,
Mhm.
there was a trade deficit between US and China. Now, my question is that, is there a way to leverage this trade deficit and make trade more sustainable through multilateral policies that benefited both countries, US and China, not only for their extended long-term trade ship, but for the good of the world? What are the constraints that kind of stop that based on your opinion and your research for goods and services?
I'm not quite like understanding your question. Can you like rephrase it? Sorry about that.
Okay, perfect. I was saying,
Mhm.
based on your presentation, there is a trade deficit between US and China. Okay, now
Yes.
how to actually leverage on that trade deficit to make trade between both countries more sustainable through multilateral policies, okay, that impact both countries positively? And if so, what may be the constraint that sort of blocks these sort of policies to be implemented in place?
Okay, thank you for your question. So US is running a trade deficit with China. So, but when I was building this model, I assumed that so for the entire economy, so this like US, China, and the rest of the world economy, the trade is we have trade balance. But I think like even though like consider trade unbalance in this model, that won't change it won't change too much about of the conclusion here.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, very, very interesting presentation. Thank you. I had a question on the downstream upstream employment result.
Yes.
So
yes.
if I understand the logic of the model, if I remember correctly, though, both the Chad-Bown paper and also the Fly and Pierce paper about these things, they do find these empirically, these negative downstream
Yes.
effects.
Yes.
They do not find this positive upstream effect. And so I was wondering whether there are ways to reconcile the model with the empirical evidence.
Yes, so like the downstream employment like is inconsistent with their numerical results. But as for like the upstream, so because like this is also depends on how do I divide the upstream and downstream in this project. So basically the idea, so when I calibrate a model, like I have like 3 countries, so United States, China, and the rest of the world, and 18 industries. And in each industry, so I have like those groups of commodities belongs to the upstreams, and the groups of commodities belongs to the downstream. So basically, when I check the upstream and downstream, I choose a cutoff point. So I assign upstreamness for each commodities and choose a cutoff point to divide the all commodities in each industries into this upstream and downstream subgroups. So when I check the data, is actually, so if I do this matching, like I match the goods heavily targeted in the trade war, those happens to, majority of them happen to located on the upstream upstream sub industries of each of the 18 industry. So like that's like how this result is coming from. And but you're right. I mean, I need like to check out the ways to verify this result I draw from the impact on the upstream employment. And also, like, I think another explanation is that in my model, I let all the workers to freely move across industries and across stages, but they can't move across countries. So it's a general equilibrium model. So the downstream employment are herded. So like they moved to the upstream. So that's like the intuition, like to generate result. But I need to check out more papers to find numerical evidence to support my result here. Thank you very much for asking the question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. I think you presented round 1 and round 2 of the trade war. But more recently, what we've seen is also some restrictions on, technology cooperation and so on. And I was just wondering whether you have looked at, the sort of dynamic effect of that sort of third round of trade tension, because the concern is really how that would affect technology adoption, flows of ideas, flows of knowledge, and things that have really increased efficiency globally and reduced even inflation globally. So the question is, if you were to do this exercise in a dynamic context, using not a static model, but a dynamic one, what would be the sort of anticipation for the result in that framework?
Thank you very much for your question. So this part mainly focusing on like the impact of tariffs. But the trade policy nowadays, the trade tension nowadays involves more than just tariffs. So as you mentioned, like the technology sanctions. So if we put it into a dynamic framework, this could be, I'm thinking like we could add the change in, because like I have this productivity, the big T, so we can have like add the dynamic on this big T. For example, like we have like the growing T in China and the growing T in the United States, and the growing T in China is going to relate it to how intense it has a trade with the United States, so we like the learning by doing process. So when the United States is doing like a sanction, a technology sanction to China, it's gonna have this strong negative impact on the growth of this big T. And so later on, which gonna makes like probably the United States gonna like shift like this technology to some other countries. So which gonna decrease China's comparative advantage in that particular industry and will even amplify the negative impact of the trade war if we're taking into account the technology sanctions regarding those productivity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just a curiosity in
I
your
would
model,
like to
initially is
extrapolate
that
your results beyond 2020, the welfare and the employment and impact on prices. Yeah. If you were
Yes.
to go beyond your study period, is this one-off or is it going to be, perpetuated beyond 2020? You have round one, round two. What happened 21, 22, 23, for example? Are you in a position to extrapolate what might happen or what's happening? In other words, I'm interested to know whether there's a one-off impact or will it gradually die down and then that's it. Was it a permanent? Also on the impact on the global value chains. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. So round one and round two. So round one like 50 billion US dollar, round two, 20 billion US dollars of Chinese importing goods. So those are the one actually implemented. And there's like a round three coming up. Like round three is like so around like United States imposing tariffs, additional tariffs on about like 300 billion US dollars Chinese imports. But like not all of those 300 are implemented. So like after the phase one deal, you can see like those two countries are actually like in terms of the tariffs are like fluctuated around the tariff level and at the point of the phase one deal. So like China is sometimes adding more goods into the targeting list, and so increase, for example, could increase tariffs from 10% to 25%, and the United States could do like similar things. But like after like several months, those two countries probably like remove some part of the goods from the targeting list or decreasing the tariffs. So it's like so after the phase one deal, like the tariff level is fluctuating around, like not deviate too much compared to the phase one deal's tariff level. So the majority of those tariffs impact are focusing on the two rounds. And after that, the tariffs does not like change too much. But the point is like after the phase one deal, like more sanction is like coming from things other than tariffs, like such as like the technology sanctions and things like that, because of some corporations or firms in China is actually added into the targeting list of the United States. It's more related to technological sanctions. Thank you.
I have a follow-up question, if that's okay. For your results table for your 2 rounds of trade war, just looking at the results right now, it seems that the impact from both round 1 and round 2 is bigger for China in terms of inflation. But on the employment side, the impact is bigger for US, both in terms of losses from downstream employment and gains from upstream employment. Can you just walk us through the intuition behind the results? Why is inflation a bigger impact for China, but employment a bigger impact for the US, both upstream and downstream?
Yes, I mean that is a very good question. So like this is the result I computed from my general employment model. As for like the intuition, I'm not like actually, like, to be honest, I don't have like a very solid answer to explain this. Yeah, I mean, frankly speaking, because like I agree with you. I actually, to be honest, I anticipate like the opposite of it. So I anticipate like the US price index could be like increased more than China. And also since China is has comparative advantage on those manufacturing industries, and like there's a lot of substitutable countries in Southeast Asia. So I assume that like the employment impact would be stronger in China. So I mean, my intuition is consistent with your comments, but like this is like the result I get. Maybe it's because like the calibration process, the comparative advantage parameters I'm choosing. So yeah, I have to be frankly with that. Thank you very much.
Can I just suggest that, I mean, it's consistent with a more inelastic upstream supply in China and a more elastic upstream supply in the United States, because then you get bigger employment and smaller price benefits of protection. But the question is also the political economy of it. Why are, these countries imposing so many restrictions that have downstream costs and upstream benefits? I mean, or why are they penalizing their own downstream industries?
Like the political reasons?
Another literature which suggests you have escalating protection, that when you extend protection upstream, then there's pressure for downstream protection and so on. But here your structure of protection, why is the US imposing so many restrictions on the intermediate sector and vice versa?
Oh, okay. So the intuition is because most of the trade nowadays, if you look at trade volume, most of the trade occur focused on intermediate goods, and because of the GVC, the global value chain things, we have like intermediate goods like passing through borders like multiple times, so it's going to amplify the impact of tariffs. So like the downstream employers happens to be the downstream industry happens to be the one like hurting the most, because they're gonna bear this multiple time like border crossing intermediate goods. So like this is like the intuition of why we should particularly protect the downstream employers, because like they bears all the trade cost along the global value chain before them.
So we have time for only one quick question, and then in the meantime, if the next presenter can just set up the ID.
So I was just wondering, these losses that you estimated, you also talked about that this is like a multi-country model. So at the global level, how do the losses stack up in terms of, other countries which are big gainers, or just like an aggregate welfare loss for the globe?
The global is negative. Like the global level. So I mean, I also have the rest of the world. So the global, we sum it up. So at the global level, the entire global economy losses from the trade war. For some countries benefit from that. For example, for Vietnam, like a substitute country, China benefit from it. But at the global level, it's a welfare loss.
So thank you very much, Yang Zhu.
Thank you.
We'll now move on. Thanks a lot. We'll now move on to Laurent Pauls from New York University, Abu Dhabi, to present his work.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here present this paper today. This is joint work with Jean-Yves, whom I've joined in the desert at New York University, Abu Dhabi. I'm currently on leave from the University of Sydney Business School, so I came from the end of the world to the middle of the world. This is recent work that we've done connected to a previous sort of project that we've had together. And what we aim to do in this paper is to contribute to the already existing and extensive literature on trade sanctions, which, this morning we've heard quite a few papers, mentioning that literature and showing that it's very much alive and at the center of current debate. What we have now is we have, very sophisticated model, general equilibrium model, frontier equilibrium model that enables us to model the consequences of these trade sanctions. And among others, two recent ones are mentioned here. There's Bakay-Fari, but there's also Ho and Levchenko, which allows us to take us off the shelf and simulate what the impact of trade sanctions would be on the economy. And in fact, recently there's been quite a few applications to the Russia's case, so the current war of between Ukraine and Russia. And so there's a couple of papers that make use of this general equilibrium model and give us some idea of what the consequences are for Ukraine and Russia and for the world when sanctions are imposed on Russia. But one recurrent difficulty that's very common with this general equilibrium model is that it requires extensive calibration. And specifically, elasticities of substitution tend to be quite hard to discipline. We've got a long literature that tries to estimate those elasticity of substitution, but they require quite a bit of work and assumptions for us to be able to use them. And this is substitution between inputs, intermediate inputs, so it could be between inputs and all other inputs, or between inputs, intermediate inputs themselves, or final goods. And hence, what we need to usually do is do extensive sensitivity analysis to work out the impact of these choices of elasticities and what they imply in terms of, the impact of response of a trade shock or an embargo as such. And beyond that, there are assumptions that we make in this general equilibrium model, and there are different general equilibrium models, and those models can, we need to run some sensitivity analysis to see what the implications are of choosing some assumptions over others, and what they imply for the impact or the consequences of trade sanctions. And as a result, it's not uncommon to see policymakers and journalists to actually take shortcuts, do back of the envelope calculations, and give us sort of headline figures that's based, typically in this case would be based on direct exports relative to output or relative to GDP, looking at your country in a particular sector that's exporting or importing from the country's sector that you want to embargo or impose trade sanctions, and work out what that means actually for your economy. The problem is that, so this is an example here of a recent, headline statistic that's been pulled out to, tells us something about what the impact of trade sanction would be on the EU. The problem with this is that there's no way to know that this is really accurate or if it has anything to do with trade sanctions in the first place. So what we do today is, or what I will present in this is that we want to use this general equilibrium model to infer an empirical or a data-based approximation to the effects of trade sanctions, okay? So what this will allow us to do is basically to bypass the need for extensive calibration and sensitivity analysis on the one hand, and on the other hand, this is going to be akin to a trade exposure type measure, where we're going to take into account both direct but also indirect, effects. And so this is looking at input-output data. We're going to look at input-output linkages, and so everything that's at the higher order and implied essentially by the value chain. So we can go away from the simple shortcuts or back-of-the-envelope calculations and include some of the higher order linkages, and at the same time not worry too much about the calibration that's required. Now, we are not proposing an alternative. This is really a complement to general equilibrium. This is an empirical complement. This is an improvement on the shortcuts, and not we're not replacing the advantages that general equilibriums provide us, because they provide us with much more flexibility, generally speaking. But we want to show that our approximation will be very close to what general equilibrium can offer. Okay, and so what we'll do, we'll apply this to embargoes on Russian, mostly energy export to the EU, And also we'll do the reverse exercise when we look at an embargo on EU goods that are coming into Russia. And so what we want to do this essentially for two reasons. We want to validate this approximation relative to the exact response that the general equilibrium model would give us on one hand. And on the other hand, we want to look at what the literature has done and sort of compare our results to literature. And then we'll give also some sort of a practical use of this approximation with some figures that it implies in terms of trade sanctions between Russia and the European Union. So what do we find? Okay, so we find that overall the approximation is pretty close to the exact response for most plausible elasticities of substitution, okay? So this is generally speaking, but this is not true for very, very, very low elasticities of substitution, such as 0.005 or lower, then the exact responses are different from the approximation. But for a wide range of plausible elasticities of substitution, our approximation seems to be doing quite well. And also, we rejoined the literature in showing that actually the impact of trade sanctions are usually quite small. Okay, so that's what this recent literature has found, especially in the case of Russia and Ukraine war, that the embargo had actually small effects overall. So that's not really surprising. We do find that there are strong asymmetries, and so some of it is not surprising, some of it is probably a bit newer. First of all, we find that Russia is much more affected than the EU. Again, this is not really a big surprise, especially on its ban on energy exports from the EU. The EU effects of taking energy from Russia or having a ban on its export is actually relatively small in the aggregate. But when we look at EU member countries, we find that there's actually a very strong asymmetry. So large Western European members, such as France or Germany, are much less affected than, say, the former Soviet satellite countries or countries that are geographically close to Russia and have shared some common history. These countries are much more affected, and they're much more impacted by embargo. And because they're small countries in the aggregate, the EU has a lower impact overall. All right, so so the efficacy of embargo depends on the availability of suppliers or markets. So we do assume a substitutability away in the approximation, and I'll explain this a little bit more in detail when we get to that point. But essentially, what we do, we use this approximation to explore historically existing alternative markets for Russia and for the EU. So specifically, we look at, can Russia or has Russia sold historically to other markets, and what does that represent relative to the EU, right? And this is in terms of the approximation. Again, we'll look at this implication both in direct and indirect sort of paths to find markets. And also, has the EU sourced, different, it flows from different markets, energy such as oil or gas in the past, and what does that represent relative to its connection with Russia? So we look at these market alternatives, and again, what we find is that there's again these strong asymmetries across the results. Russia has some alternatives, but they are much smaller than the EU. So it's quite limited for Russian export. We find that across the EU, large economies in the EU already have historical alternative supplies for energy, but the small Eastern European economy seems to be mostly affected, and their alternative markets are much less available to them than for larger European economies. Okay. Okay. So all right. All right, so we show that also that, so one more point here, we show that this happens, the reason why Eastern Europeans are mostly affected is because they're mostly the most integrated in terms of intensity and length of supply chain into the supply chain with the Russian economy. Also, we go on and show that this is also connected to the infrastructure, specifically pipeline infrastructure. And so what we look at is we look at Russian pipelines and the production of electricity in the EU, and we look at how different countries get impacted by this supply with a different data set. Okay, so there's a few things to go through. So I'm going to start with the model. The model is pretty standard. So this is a model from Huo and Levchenko. So we take it off the shelf and we look at what would it mean to have a trade sanction or a change in trade costs. So let me go through a couple of details here to sort of tell you what's going on. So the production, again, is pretty standard. We've got, here we go. So this is materials here, aggregate intermediate inputs, which depends on, this is the input-output data, right? So this is the intermediate trade linkages that we have. The subscript, so below here are the countries, the superscript are the industries. The first one tells us the origin or the source, and the second one tells us the destination where it's sold to. So this is an intermediate input produced in JS, so in country J, sector S, sold to country I, sector R. Okay, so that's the this thing here. We've got elasticities of substitution for final goods and intermediate. So for final goods and intermediate goods. So for intermediate it's epsilon, and for final goods it's rho. It's one elasticity of substitution for all intermediate inputs. It's all CES. Same for final goods. So it's all CES. There's no distinction between energy and other inputs in this model. So it's one thing here. We have a market clearing condition. Again, pretty standard. It tells us, that the output here comes from either final users or intermediate inputs here. We have two market shares, which gives us the allocation. One for final goods, which is pi here, and XC here gives us the one for intermediate goods. And the idea here is going to be to shock or give a trade shock here at tau. Tau is our trade cost parameter. So you can simulate the model by giving a trade shock, looking at reallocation here in these trade shares according to different types of elasticities. So the epsilon and the rho, we'll look at different values of elasticities. And then that will give us, the response of the model by, using these assumptions, plugging everything into the market condition and the market clearing condition, and then solving the model for the equilibrium. So this is really standard. There's not much, nothing really new here. So the solution that we are getting essentially is, so we get a vector of value-added response. So it's a vector because it's value-added response at country sector level. Okay. And so that basically depends on two things. So we've got nominal output response. So this is a response of nominal output, okay, across country sectors. And it's corrected for so the response of CPI, which is a country level CPI response, okay? And so this endogenous variable here is essentially, as it's a response to trade shocks, and it's defined or determined by this lambda matrix, which is an influence matrix, which captures all the network or the trade effects across the whole global economy in here. Okay. So yes, once again, we'll just compute the shocks, simulate the model, and then get the response. Okay. 5 minutes. Okay, I've got to speed up a little bit. So what do we do for the approximation? There's two things here. We're going to assume away the effect of the CPI. So it's going to be atomistic at most, or first order matter, the effect of CPI to a trade shock. Our approximation is really short term. It's not a long-term approximation. So that's what will happen here. And then we will look at an empirical approximation here, which is the percentage response of nominal output to an embargo, which is this guy here, this term here that will approximate. So we have so first of all, how do we do this? Well, we've got two candidate approximation, right? So we're going to use this hypothetical extraction, and we have two candidate approximation, one upstream and one for downstream. So if we start with the downstream measure here, we've got, so this matrix A here is the input-output data. It's the direct requirement matrix. And what we'll do is, so this is, again, this is nominal output as a, a function of the final use at different order. So you have a higher order here because it's captured by the Leontief inverse. And so this is part here is nominal output minus, this is the first term, and the second term is essentially this A matrix here that's been modified. So we put actually values in this A matrix to 0 that corresponds to the country sector that's being embargoed. So it's all the other countries, as usual, without the countries and sectors essentially that are being embargoed here relative to total nominal output here. Okay, so we call this hot. This is higher order trade, right? And symmetrically, we do another measure, which is, which we call short source higher order trade. So this is really pretty much symmetric here. Now we're looking at, again, this matrix B. This is the allocation matrix. This part here is, again, nominal output as, coming from primary factors at, all levels, so a higher order as well. Again, we have a Leontief inverse here that gives us, so the value chain, so the higher order connections. And similarly here, we are going to modify B so that we can remove all the inputs that are coming from the sector country that's being embargoed. And so we can look at the difference between these two, and that will give us the approximate response to a trade embargo in this case here. Okay, so so this is what we consider. We could consider a few scenarios. So we're going to consider an embargo on Russian exports into the EU, right? And then we look at the EU value-added response to this, not having inputs from Russia. So this is the shot measure that I mentioned earlier. And then we look at what the impact is, for Russia. Basically, we'll look at, how Russian exports, direct and indirectly are being affected by this embargo, and that's captured by HOT. And then we do the reverse sort of exercise where we are embargoing European exports to Russia. And again, we have two measures. So this means, the downstream, it's a downstream shock. So for the EU, so we look at the EU value-added response to this embargo, which is captured by HOT. And again, we look at the Russian value-added response from not getting any inputs from Russia, and that's captured by SHOT. So I don't have much time, but this is basically, there's a few things here that I want to quickly mention. So in yellow, you have the exact model response. In black, you have our approximation, which is flat across different elasticities of substitution. You can see that generally speaking, I mean, I want to very quickly summarize that the exact response of the model is relatively flat across different elasticities and for the given assumptions. And so for plausible elasticity, except for very, very low ones, the approximation actually is quite close to the model's exact response. So you have an example here. Approximate response here is 1.33%, decrease here. And this is the average of that surface, yellow bluish surface. That's 1.3%. That's what the exact model would imply. And you can see that the impact on Russia is much larger than the EU, which is much lower here in this particular case. Again, we are relatively close to this. Now we reverse. We look at an embargo on European exports. So we're looking at again the two responses from the EU and from Russia. And again, here the surface is relatively flat, except for very, very low sort of level of elasticity. So we actually do quite well. So in practice, what we want to do is we want to look at what the approximation means in terms of putting embargoes on specific Russian energy or European exports. And in order to give you a number for country or at sector level, we have to sort of aggregate this up or average this up. And we do this with value-added weights essentially. So we can do this at the country level, at the sector level for shots. This is the upstream measure. And then the downstream measure, we can do this with HOT. Okay. So a few things here. I don't have a lot of time, but just you know, so the effects of Russia is on the left side. The effect on Europe. So this is the EU aggregated sectors. So the top 10 sectors that are most affected in Russia, in the EU, and then the top 10 most affected countries in here. Okay. So you can see that this short-term effect here is 1.3% of GDP in aggregate for Russia, whereas for European Union it's only 0.08. The thing that I want to highlight here is that the Eastern European economy seems to be the most affected by this embargo on Russian energy. How do we compare to the literature? The literature has a decrease in 0.6% of GDP for Russia. This is lower than ours, but ours is really a short-term measure, whereas this is a long-term estimation. Okay. Again, here we're looking at all exports. This is pretty much the same as before, except that the number increased quite substantially. I think what I'll say is that, again, the list of countries that are most affected are the same as before, mostly Eastern European or small economies. Again, we join up quite well with the literature. Again, this 1.06% here is a long-run effect, whereas we provide a short-term impact. And again, the impact on Germany here is very similar to the impact on the overall EU in this case. Okay, so we also look at the impact of banning EU exports here. Again, this is the most affected sectors in Russia. The most affected economies are, again, the Eastern European economy. So this is a recurrent sort of thing. You can see that the impacts are actually overall quite small. Okay, so one of the things we do, if I can take a couple more minutes, we look at the availability of alternatives. Like I mentioned, we don't have substitution with this approximation. So what we look at historical alternatives. Were there other countries supplying energy to the European Union? Which one are those? What are the markets for Russia outside of the European Union? What it represents? Okay, so we're going to compute shares of production that historically served alternative markets or use alternative inputs as a share of its total output within that particular sectors. Again, here, this is for Russia. So this is for Russian exports. We look at petroleum, specifically energy sectors and all Russian sectors. You can see that basically, refined petroleum products from Russia exports, directly and indirectly. It's very important. Both measures together a substantial amount relative, for example, to the US, which is 5 times smaller. Okay, so the EU, there are markets, alternative markets for Russia, such as China here, but they are half the size of what Europe is, or the US, for example, which is 1/5 of the size overall. Again, we're looking at the impact of Europe on Europe here. We took 4 countries, 2 large ones, France and Germany, usual suspects, I guess, and then we took, quite randomly, we could have taken other countries, Latvia and Bulgaria. Here, the point is, electricity and gas seem in France uses 1.82% relative to its overall output in electricity, gas, and steam that comes from Russian energy. And you can see that it imports, so it takes more inputs even from Saudi Arabia and a little bit less from Kazakhstan. And for Germany, you have Norway and Kazakhstan as alternative, which are larger than Russia. Okay. Whereas in the case of Latvia and Bulgaria here, we can see that they heavily depend on Russia. So they're very integrated with, the length and intensity of the supply chain for these countries, connected to Russia is very, very large, very important. You can see that the source of alternatives for Latvia and Bulgaria is almost non-existent in here. They depend, heavily on Russian energy. Okay, so why is this? Well, we computed basically the ratio of direct, indirect to direct exports. So that ratio tells us the bigger it is, the more important the indirect effects are, right? The smaller it is, the closer it is to 1, the closer it is to just direct exports and no indirect exports whatsoever. And so this tells us, the length and the intensity of the value chain. And so that tells us here that, Czech Republic here is heavily integrated with Russia. Same for the other Eastern and smaller economies in Europe. You can see that the numbers are very large, and so they're part of that very long and very intensive supply chain with Russia. And so so they essentially they're more integrated and more dependent. So that's one thing. The other thing that we do, this is the last thing, then I'll stop, is we explore the importance of transport infrastructure, especially pipeline infrastructure in Europe, and we look at what it implies for production of electricity in European countries. So we're looking at, Russian transport via pipeline as IR, and JS is any European countries in production of electricity and gas. We use this Exio base in 2021. It's much more granular for this sort of things. Again, here very quickly, what we show essentially is that the Eastern European economies with former satellite sort of countries of the Soviet Union are very much integrated in the infrastructure with Russia, and this explains why they are so dependent. Okay, so very quickly conclude. So we provide a database approximation to the effect of trade embargo. There's no substitution and therefore no elasticity to calibrate. Obviously, it's not a replacement for general equilibrium. Okay, we just provide a better empirical sort of approximation than rules of thumbs or just very quick shortcuts. We basically document the effect of the embargo involving Russia, and we show that it's quite asymmetric overall. Hopefully, we've illustrated the approximation's potential, and we intend to make this sort of simulations, also this approximation available online and through our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we'll open the floor now. Sergio?
No, we have not. It's a good point, actually, evasion. So alternative countries are taking up the slack that would come from from Russia or from Europe to exports or imports things. It's a very good point. It's the approximation is really short-term, impacts that's available in the historical data. So there's no avenue for substitution and no avenue for leakages. I mean, I don't know if this would qualify this as leakages, but yes, it's a very good point. I think this merits further investigation, because so long term, also the question is, how much the substitution matter more than the actual sort of evasion of these sanctions. I think that's still up for debate. So that's a very good question. Thank you.
So I'm a bit confused on the elasticity of substitution. Is it that you couldn't calibrate the elasticity of substitution, so you concluded that there is no substitution? Or the assumption was that there is no substitution, hence you couldn't calibrate?
Okay, so basically, yep. I'll go to a slide so that's probably easier. So when we do when we do this here, we set a sector country to 0, which is being embargoed. So if EU embargoes Russia energy, then it's 0 for all inputs of energy that comes into the European Union from Russia. And in that sense, there is no substitution. So that's what we mean by there's no substitution available. There's no possibilities for Russia or EU in that sort of framework to actually substitute away so the approximation doesn't take into account substitution. It cannot.
So meaning there is no need calibrating for the elasticity if there is no substitution.
No, that's correct. That's correct. And the calibration of elasticity of substitution goes into the general equilibrium model. And as I've mentioned very quickly, these tend to be relatively flat overall. And so, for most plausible, it seems that the approximation is actually quite okay, except if you have extreme sort of elasticity of substitution in that particular model,
So if there were to be substitution and you were to calibrate the elasticity of substitution, will it be per sector-wise or per product in this case?
That's right.
I mean, if there were to be substitution and you were to calibrate for the elasticity of substitution, Are you going to do it per sector-wise in this case?
No, so you can't do it in the approximation, right? So there's no way to approximate, so to do any calibration. So it's only in the model that you can calibrate. And so, but this model here assumes one elasticity of substitution for all inputs, regardless of the sector it comes from. So that's yes, that's just a general CES function for all inputs.
There are two views on sanctions. One is sanctions are effective in punishing countries.
Yes.
The other is sanctions are useless, as pointed out from your study. So is it true to say that sanctions are imposed mainly for non-economic reasons? There's so many alternatives you can substitute. I mean, India buying fuel from Russia and China as well, increasing purchases from China. So that's point number one. Sanctions are imposed mainly for non-economic reasons, and it's very, very difficult to quantify. The others apply this model to say smaller countries like Myanmar, so the outcome would be a lot different. I mean, Russia is a huge country, relatively developed. For poorer countries, sanctions can have a bigger impact on the economy.
Yeah, okay. So good. Yeah, so non-economic reason, I think that makes sense, right? So it's politically motivated as a sort of really, it's almost diplomatic. Diplomatic relations needs to be severed in some way. So you impose these economic sanctions, which show that don't have much impact, but yet they have non-economic impact. So I think I agree with that. I don't like, as you said, it's very difficult to quantify. So it would be very difficult to work out really what it achieves. Maybe it has some political achievements that would be that would come out in some ways, but yes, purely economically, it's very limited. The other one is on smaller countries. Yes, this is so we are just doing this on the European Union. It looks like small countries are more affected, but in this particular case, I would have to qualify this in that we find that it's not just the size of the country or the relative income of the country, because these small countries tend to have a slightly lower income than some of the larger economies in the European Union, but it's also your integration in the value chain. So how much you're connected into the value chain, how intensive is the value chain that you're in, and how connected you are. And in the European case, it's even more specific because there is also infrastructure that's involved. But generally speaking, just the connection in sort of integration in value chain would be important. So if you're a completely isolated country, I'm not sure that you're much less likely to be affected by these sanctions than if you are actually maybe small, poor, but quite integrated, quite dependent on.
Sorry, very interesting. A question on this. These were two unilateral embargoes, right?
Yes.
So you could look also at the war episodes, right, where the two
yes.
are actually doing the same. This is a new calculation you need to do, like with your approximation, right? It's not exactly what you showed.
Yes. So it's a good point. I didn't spend much time on the data. The headline we produce is from ICO OECD 2018. The pipelines we look at before the war, so 2021, we have data on that.
No, but even just this slide, right? So you are considering embargo on Russia into EU without a reaction, right? Without a retaliation. So it's two unilateral hypotheses. Okay.
Yes.
It would be interesting also to see when both do the same thing, right? When
right. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. That's a fair point. That's
it's just an interesting
exercise
to do.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you.
The question. So great presentation, great paper. Thank you. Just building off Tokpa's observation, I was kind of intrigued by your finding that diminished exports from Russia to EU hurt it more than diminished imports to Russia. And I was wondering what your time horizon is, or maybe you mentioned it and I missed it, because the impact of diminished imports arguably could be more severe because it leads to degradation, to less technology coming in, whereas for exports, you can diversify markets. So China, India stepping into the game. It's much more difficult for Russia to diversify its imports unless it relies heavily on China, but that's a geopolitical consideration. So I wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's a good point. So this is why I really have to insist that the approximation is really short term. So what you talked about technology transfer, it's very relevant. You're right, of course. but this would be much more medium to long-term sort of impact. So we can't capture this immediately. So this would be more of a requires sort of long-term or more medium-term sort of impact. So it's definitely a very good point to look into. But again, that might be more suited for more fleshed out models that look at long-run consequences with substitutability taking into account, right? So yeah, thank you.
Just a thought on expanding a little bit on the political effects or the potential political effects. These approximations, they give you a sort of an approximate treatment effect, and you can just collect social survey data from ESS or Gallup poll and take that as a baseline and imagine two countries that share a border, but they have different treatment effects. And there are questions about their views in Russia or the effectiveness of the EU. So you can get some proxies and think in a very short window, pre and post, get some measures about the political consequences of these based on your approximations. And I think that could be a cheap exercise to sort of validate the potential consequences.
Okay, good point. I might talk to you afterwards for this survey data. But thank you.
Yes. So may I suggest a reference? It's called Trade War and Peace: How to Impose International Trade Sanctions. Yes. So the co-authors are me, myself, and Gustavo Souza, Chicago Fed, and Yuan Mei and Na Yuan Hu at Singapore Management University. So in that paper, we study, optimal, sanctions imposed by, countries under different willingness to pay for sanctions. I think it's sort of related. So, I mean, I was wondering, like, in this paper, we do a, first order approximation. I mean, in your work, I mean, how good is it in terms of, approximating, different, elasticities of substitution across sectors and across countries? And when we think about, embargo, I think is a pretty large deviation from the steady state, right? So with that, I'm not sure, like, could you, discuss a bit on this?
Yeah, sure. So basically, maybe afterwards you can give me the reference, so I can be happy to have a look at it. So thanks for that. Yes. So essentially, again, this is a short-term approximation, right? So for different elasticities, we tend to show that actually the model that we're using, this general equilibrium model, and the approximation are actually quite close, except for very extreme sort of elasticities of substitution. So there are limitations, obviously, to this. But overall, in the exercise that we do, we only show about 4 exercises here, but we've run several others, and they all seem to agree that actually it doesn't. So the elasticities of substitution, for plausible range are okay. Now you're mentioning elasticities for different sectors. So here it's one elasticity of substitution for intermediate inputs and one for final goods. So this is CES. What would it mean if you had different elasticities of substitution, let's say for energy products versus manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera? I'm not sure. The model doesn't really accommodate this. I'm sure it's a very interesting question. I mean, hopefully your approximation says, you can do away with that in sort of at the first order as a short term. Obviously, if you're looking at for again, medium to long run impacts and getting a more accurate pictures, then obviously, going to this detail might be useful. But we haven't really gotten into this detail. So yeah, thank you.